You know how sometimes you look at something familiar and you think, yeah, yeah, I get it. I know what that is.
Uh-huh.
Like trees. I mean, we see them everywhere, right?
Yeah.
But there's this quote from a forest ecologist named Miles Silman that always kind of stuck with me. He said, they take a little more appreciation.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's like he's saying there's this whole hidden depth to trees that we often miss, you
Right.
know?
I see what you mean.
He even compares it to understanding like a really good wine.
Yeah.
The more
Definitely.
you learn about it, the more you realize how much there is to discover.
Oh, I like that analogy.
And that's kind of what we're all about here, right? Trying to dig a little deeper and find those aha moments in the stuff we think we already know.
Exactly.
And today we're doing exactly that with trees, but not just any trees. We're heading high up into the Andes in eastern Peru to the edge of this incredible place called Manu National Park.
Oh, wow.
Have you ever been?
I haven't. No.
Oh man. It's just, picture this, right? You're at like 12,000 feet elevation. The air is thin. You're surrounded by this really hardy scrub vegetation, maybe a few llamas or cows grazing nearby.
Sounds peaceful.
Oh, it is. And the sunset, it's like nothing you've ever seen, just explodes across the sky. And then stretching out in front of you is this panorama of the entire Amazon River system.
Wow.
Just this endless green carpet of life. It's breathtaking.
I can imagine.
But that view isn't just pretty, right? It speaks to something much bigger. Silman actually pointed out that from that very spot, you could potentially see 1 out of every 9 bird species on the entire planet.
Really?
Yeah, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And within their research plots down in the park, they've documented over 1,000 different kinds of trees.
1,000.
1,000 tree species. Think about that. That's more than you'd find in the entire boreal forest of Canada.
That's mind-blowing.
Right. So we're talking about an insane amount of biodiversity concentrated in this one relatively small area.
Yeah, and I bet even just getting to this research site is an adventure in itself.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Even the journey there kind of gives you a sense of how unique this place is. You're driving for hours along these winding dirt roads, passing through tiny villages, clinging to impossibly steep slopes.
Oh, wow.
You see people farming on these hillsides that look like they're practically vertical. It's incredible.
Yeah.
And you're buying coca leaves from locals along the way to help with the altitude. It's a whole different world.
It sounds like it.
But Miles Silman's work isn't just about cataloging all this diversity, right? He's really trying to understand the bigger picture. How are these incredibly complex forest communities put together? And how are they being affected by climate change? Which is obviously a huge concern everywhere, but especially in these sensitive ecosystems.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a major focus.
So to study this, he set up these really ingenious tree plots along an elevational gradient. What that means is he has these plots going all the way from high up in the cloud forests at over 11,000 feet down to near sea level in the Amazonian lowlands.
Oh, wow, that's a huge range.
It is, and the idea is that each plot represents a completely different forest community shaped by the changes in temperature and other environmental factors as you go up or down in elevation.
So it's like a natural experiment already set up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to dive into today. The world of tropical forest ecology through the lens of Silman's research in Manu. We're going to explore what his work tells us about the mind-boggling biodiversity of this place and what it reveals about the very real impacts of a changing climate.
I'm ready.
All right, let's jump in. Okay, so first things first. When we think about where life thrives on Earth, it's not evenly distributed, right? There's this really clear pattern.
Right.
Like if you think about it, there's way more diversity and abundance of life in the tropics near the equator compared to the poles.
Yeah, definitely.
This is actually something that naturalists noticed centuries ago.
Really?
Yeah, like Alexander von Humboldt, he was this Prussian explorer and naturalist who traveled all over South America in the early 1800s.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him.
And he was just blown away by the sheer abundance of life in the tropics. He described it as a spectacle as varied as the azure vault of the heavens.
That's a pretty vivid description.
Right. He was basically saying that the tropics are this explosion of life forms. It's like the planet's biggest party is happening there.
So this difference in diversity between the tropics and the poles, it's a well-established pattern, right?
Totally. It's called the latitudinal diversity gradient, or LDG for short.
LDG, got it.
It's like one of the most fundamental patterns in ecology. But here's the thing. Even though we've known about it for so long, scientists are still debating exactly why it exists.
That's interesting. So what are some of the leading theories?
Well, there are a few main contenders. One idea is that evolution just works faster in the tropics.
Faster evolution. How so?
Well, think about it. The tropics are warm and sunny year-round, right? Lots of rain, too.
Yeah,
So plants can grow like crazy. Animals can reproduce more often. There are just more generations happening in a shorter amount of time.
makes sense.
And with more generations, you have more chances for genetic mutations to pop up.
Oh yeah, mutations of the raw material for evolution.
Exactly. And some of those mutations can lead to new traits that might eventually give rise to entirely new species.
So it's like the tropics are this evolutionary hotbed with things changing and adapting much more quickly than in colder climates.
That's the idea. It's like the evolutionary engine is running in overdrive down there.
That's a cool way to think about it.
Another theory focuses on the idea that tropical species are just pickier about their environment.
Pickier, how do you mean?
Well, the tropics have this really stable climate, right? The temperature doesn't fluctuate that much throughout the year.
Right, pretty consistent compared to places with distinct seasons.
So over time, species in the tropics have evolved to be adapted to these very specific conditions. They have what we call narrow thermal tolerances.
Meaning they can only survive within a small temperature range.
Exactly. And that makes them super sensitive to even slight changes in their surroundings. So even something like a small change in elevation up a mountainside can create enough of a temperature difference to act like a barrier between populations of a species.
So they get isolated from each other even though they're geographically close.
Yep. And once those populations are isolated, they start to evolve independently, and eventually they might become distinct enough to be considered different species.
Wow, so even subtle environmental variations can drive speciation in the tropics.
Right. And there's even this really interesting paper with this kind of catchy title. It's called Why Mountain Passes Are Higher in the Tropics.
Huh. Why mountain passes are higher in the tropics?
Yeah, I know it's a bit of a head scratcher, but it basically refers to this idea that even small changes in elevation in the tropics can create these significant ecological barriers for species.
Because of those narrow tolerances.
Exactly. So those mountain passes are effectively higher in the tropics because even a small climb can mean a big change in the types of species you find.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like the ecological landscape is more finely divided in the tropics.
Exactly. And then the third major theory focuses on the simple fact that the tropics are really old.
Oh, right, like ancient rainforests haven't been disturbed by ice ages and stuff?
Exactly. So these tropical ecosystems have had millions and millions of years to just accumulate species without being wiped clean by glaciers like what happened in higher latitudes.
Makes sense.
It's like Alfred Russel Wallace, one of the founders of evolutionary theory, he said that in the tropics, evolution has had a fair chance.
Meaning it's had ample time to work its magic.
Right. And that's led to this incredible buildup of diversity that we see today.
Okay, so it's this combination of faster evolution, more specialized species, and just the sheer amount of time that's given the tropics this incredible biodiversity advantage.
That's the current thinking. It's likely a mix of all these factors working together.
It's fascinating to think about.
It is, and it also sets the stage for understanding why a place like Manu National Park is so incredibly special for biodiversity.
Right, smack dab in the middle of the tropics, like the epicenter of all this evolutionary action.
Yeah, exactly. So let's get into Silman's research there.
Okay.
So to study how these different forest communities are structured and how they respond to changes in elevation and temperature, Silman established these 17 really carefully chosen plots.
These are those 2.5-acre plots you mentioned,
Yeah.
right?
Each one is 2.5 acres. And they're arranged along an elevational gradient that covers a huge range. Like we're talking from over 11,000 feet in the Andes all the way down to near sea level in the Amazon basin.
Wow, that's a serious commitment to data collection.
Oh, it is. And the level of detail they go into is just mind-blowing. Within each of these plots, they've tagged, measured, and identified every single tree with a diameter of over 4 inches.
Every single tree.
Yeah, no joke. It's a massive undertaking.
I can imagine.
Just to give you an idea, one of the plots, Plot 4, has 777 individual trees belonging to 60 different species.
Seriously, that's more trees than I can even picture.
It's a lot of trees. And remember, they're doing this for 17 plots in total.
That's an insane amount of data.
It is, and that's just the baseline data. Then they have to go back and resurvey those plots every few years to track how the trees are growing and changing.
So they can see how things are being affected by climate change.
Exactly. And because of the differences in elevation between these plots, you get some pretty significant variations in temperature.
Right, the higher you go, the colder it gets.
Yep. So, for example, plot 4 has an average annual temperature of about 53 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
But plot 3, which is just 800 feet higher, is about 2 degrees cooler on average.
So just a small difference in elevation can mean a big difference in temperature.
Totally. And then plot 5, which is about 800 feet lower than plot 4, it's about 3 degrees warmer.
Okay, so there's a pretty clear temperature gradient along this mountain slope.
Exactly. And remember how we talked about tropical species having those narrow thermal tolerances?
Yeah, they're really sensitive to temperature changes.
So even these seemingly small temperature differences can have a huge impact on which tree species can thrive in each plot.
Right, they basically determine who gets to live where.
Exactly. As you move from one plot to the next, even if they're relatively close together, you see a big turnover in the species composition.
Meaning different species dominate in different plots.
Right. And what's even more interesting is that Silman found that some of the dominant tree species within a plot actually have the narrowest altitudinal distributions.
Meaning they're only found within a very specific elevation range.
Yep. Which suggests that they're really specialized to the very particular conditions at that elevation.
Okay, so this meticulous work of mapping out all these trees and their distributions,
Mhm.
it's all building towards this bigger question, right?
Yeah.
How are these forests going to respond to climate change?
That's the million-dollar question. And Silman actually had this really evocative image in mind. He called it the Burnham Woods scenario.
Well, I've heard that phrase. Isn't that from Macbeth?
It is. It's the scene where this whole forest seems to be moving towards Macbeth's castle.
Right, it's like a prophecy of his doom.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, trees can actually uproot themselves and walk around. But Silman was using it as a metaphor for how climate change could cause entire forest communities to shift their distribution over time.
Oh, I see. So as temperatures warm up, species that are adapted to cooler temperatures might start to die off in the lower elevation.
That's the idea. And at the same time, those same species might find more favorable conditions at higher elevations where it's still cool enough for them to thrive.
So they might start to expand their range upslope.
Exactly. And that could lead to a gradual but significant movement of the whole forest community over time.
It's like the forest is slowly marching uphill to escape the heat.
Exactly. And that's not just some far-off hypothetical scenario. It's something that Silman and his team are actually starting to see in their data.
Oh, really? They were already seeing evidence of this.
They are. So they did this first major resurvey of their plots back in 2007, and what they found was pretty surprising.
What did they find?
They were expecting to see some changes eventually, right? But they thought it would take decades for any noticeable shifts to occur.
Yeah, that makes sense. Trees grow slowly?
But this 2007 resurvey was led by one of Silman's students, Kenneth Feely, and he was analyzing the data, and he realized that the forest was already measurably in motion.
Wow, after only a few years.
Yep, they were starting to see statistically significant shifts in the average elevational distribution of whole groups of tree species.
So not just individual species, but entire genera were moving.
Exactly. And they were even able to calculate the rate of this movement by looking at how the average elevational midpoint for different tree genera was changing over time.
Oh, wow, so they could actually put a number on how fast the forest is moving.
They could. And on average, it was about 8 feet per year.
8 feet per year.
Yeah. Which might not sound like a lot, but over time that adds up.
That's true.
But here's the really interesting part. The rate of movement varied dramatically between different tree genera.
Oh, so some were moving faster than others.
Much faster. Like there was this one genus, Schefflera, which belongs to the ginseng family. Yeah, and they were practically sprinting uphill. Their average rate of movement was almost 100 feet per year.
100 feet? That's incredible.
Right. Like they had some kind of internal GPS telling them to get to higher ground fast.
And were all the tree genera moving that fast?
Not even close. Some were much slower. Like there was this other genus, Ilex, the hollies.
Ilex.
And they were basically standing still. They showed barely any movement at all.
Wow, so you have some species racing uphill and others just hanging back.
Exactly. And that really highlights a key point.
Hmm?
The impacts of global warming are not going to be uniform across all species.
Right, some will be better equipped to adapt or migrate than others.
Totally. It's like you said before, different cliques of kids at recess reacting in different ways to the same situation.
Exactly. Some are going to be totally fine and others are going to struggle.
And that's what makes this whole thing so complex and unpredictable. We're not talking about a simple uniform shift of an entire forest community. It's going to be this really messy process with winners and losers and lots of reshuffling of ecological relationships along the way.
Yeah, I could see how that would make it difficult to predict what's going to happen.
Totally. It's a really dynamic situation.
Now, it's important to keep in mind, though, that life on Earth has always had to deal with fluctuations in temperature, right?
That's a great point.
It's not like organisms evolved in a perfectly static climate.
Right. They've always had to cope with some degree of variability.
Exactly. Like even on a daily basis, there are temperature swings between day and night.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there are seasonal changes throughout the year.
Right. And in the tropics, you have rainy seasons and dry seasons, which also affect temperature and humidity.
Exactly. So organisms have evolved all sorts of ways to deal with these natural fluctuations.
Right. From things like hibernation and migration to all sorts of physiological and behavioral adaptations.
Yep. They've got a whole toolkit for dealing with temperature changes.
And then if you loom out even further, there have been some really dramatic climate shifts throughout Earth's history.
Oh, yeah, like ice ages.
Exactly. Like over the last 40 million years or so, Earth has actually been in a general cooling phase.
The cooling phase.
Yep. And that eventually led to the Pleistocene epoch, which started about 2.5 million years ago.
The Pleistocene.
And that was characterized by these really intense cycles of glacial periods and interglacial periods.
Medium ice ages, basically.
Right. Massive ice sheets would advance and retreat across continents, causing huge changes in sea level and temperature.
Yeah, that must have had a huge impact on life.
It did. It forced species to either adapt to these wildly fluctuating conditions or migrate to more suitable areas.
So they had to move to keep up with the changing climate.
Exactly. And Darwin actually talked about this a lot in his work on evolution.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He saw these large-scale migrations as a key driver of speciation. And we have tons of fossil evidence to support this idea.
Like, how do we know that species were migrating during the ice ages?
Well, one way is by looking at fossils of things like insects.
Insects?
Yeah. There are these really well-preserved fossil insect remains from different time periods.
Okay.
And by studying those fossils, scientists can track how the distribution of different species changed over time.
Cool. So what do those fossils tell us?
Well, they show that even tiny creatures were moving thousands of miles during the ice ages to stay within their preferred climate zones.
Wow, so they were making some serious journeys.
They were. Like, there's this beetle called Tachinus chilotus that's now typically found in Mongolia.
Okay.
But during the last glacial period, it was a common inhabitant of England.
Well, that's a long way to travel for a beetle.
Right. It shows just how dramatically these ice age cycles affected the distribution of life.
So we know that organisms have adapted to major climate shifts in the past.
Yeah.
But what's different about the warming we're seeing today?
The key difference, and this is a big one, is the rate of change.
The rate.
Yeah, the speed at which the climate is warming.
Okay.
So the overall magnitude of the warming we're projected to see in this century, if we don't get our act together on emissions, it could be comparable to the temperature swings between glacial periods and interglacial periods.
So the overall change might be similar, but it's happening much faster this time?
Exactly, and that's the problem.
So how much faster is it happening?
Well, estimates vary, but scientists generally agree that the current rate of warming is at least 10 times faster than the natural climate shifts of the past.
10 times faster. That's a huge difference.
It is, and for a lot of species, that's just way too fast to adapt.
Yeah. It doesn't give them much time to evolve or migrate.
That's the big worry. And it kind of brings us back to those fast-moving Schefflera trees and Silman's plots.
Right, the ones moving 100 feet uphill per year.
They seem to be among the few species that are actually keeping pace with the rapid warming.
So they're the lucky ones.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder how many other species out there are going to be left behind.
Right, how many just won't be able to adjust quickly enough?
That's the big unknown.
It's a sobering thought.
It is, but it's the reality we're facing. The speed of change is unlike anything life on Earth has experienced in recent history.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the big picture of biodiversity and climate change. But let's bring it back to Manu National Park itself. What are some of the really unique species that we find there?
Oh man, there are so many. Manu is like a biodiversity treasure chest.
It is.
It's home to tons of what we call endemic species, meaning they're found nowhere else on Earth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like there's this really cool tree fern called Cyathea multisegmenta.
Alzatea multisegmenta.
It has these really intricate fronds that are divided into all these tiny segments.
I'll have to look that one up.
And then there are all these amazing birds like the white-cheeked toady flycatcher,
White-cheeked toady flycatcher.
which is this tiny little bird with these bright white cheek patches.
Oh, that sounds cute.
It is. And then there's Barbara Brown's brush-tailed rat.
A rat named after someone named Barbara Brown.
I know, right? It's a pretty cool name for a rat.
It is.
And then there's this little black toad called Rhinella manu.
Rhinella manu.
It has these unique patterns on its skin. And there was actually this funny story about one of Silman's students who was obsessed with trying to find this toad.
Oh, really? What happened?
Well, he knew that Rhinella manu was nocturnal, so he would go out into the forest at night and try to find them.
And did he ever find one?
He didn't on that trip, unfortunately, but it just shows how passionate these researchers are about the biodiversity of this place.
Yeah, they're really dedicated.
But there's also this underlying concern about this toad and other amphibians in Manu.
Oh, right, because amphibians are facing a lot of threats globally.
They are. And one of the biggest is this devastating fungal disease called chytrid fungus.
Chytrid fungus.
It's super contagious and often fatal for amphibians.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's been detected within Manu.
Oh, no, that's not good.
Yeah, it's a big worry. So the future of these endemic amphibian species, like Rhinella manu, is uncertain given the combined pressures of habitat loss and disease.
It's a reminder that these threats to biodiversity are often interconnected and complex.
Totally. It's rarely just one thing. It's usually a whole bunch of factors working together.
Yeah.
But amidst all these challenges, there's also this really cool thing happening in Manu, the discovery of new species.
Oh, yeah.
Even though scientists have been studying this area for decades, Silman and his students are constantly finding things that are new to science.
That's amazing.
It is.
Yeah.
They've already identified about 30 new tree species.
30 new trees. That's crazy.
And they think there could be hundreds more out there still waiting to be discovered.
Wow, so we're still just scratching the surface of what's out there.
Exactly. And it's not just new species they're finding. They even stumbled across an entirely new genus of tree within the Euphorbiaceae family.
Whoa, a whole new genus. That's a big deal, right?
It is. It's like discovering a whole new category of trees, like finding a new type of oak or hickory.
Yeah, that's a major discovery.
And these aren't just tiny little inconspicuous trees either. Some of them have really unique features.
Oh, like what?
Well, one of the new genera they found has these seed capsules that look like flowering lilies.
Seed capsules that look like lilies. That's wild.
Right. They have this tough, woody exterior like a hazelnut shell, but the overall shape and structure is super delicate and looks just like a lily flower.
That's incredible.
It just shows how much diversity is still out there waiting to be found.
Yeah, and I love how Silman talks about these plants. He uses these really evocative words to describe them.
Oh, yeah, he gets so excited about
It's
it.
like he calls them charismatic and hilarious and even crazy.
Right. He's clearly in love with these organisms.
It's infectious.
It is. And it's not just the plants either. You mentioned seeing a group of woolly monkeys, which just brings the whole forest to life.
Oh, yeah. Those were amazing.
Just seeing them swinging through the trees. It's a reminder that we're talking about a whole interconnected ecosystem, not just individual species.
Right. It's all part of this complex web of life.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important concept in ecology, the species-area relationship.
Oh, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it's often shortened to SAR, and it's one of the most basic but powerful ideas in the field.
Okay, so what is it exactly?
Well, it basically says that larger areas tend to have more species.
Makes sense. The more space you have, the more different types of habitats and niches you can support.
That's the idea. And this relationship has been observed by naturalists for centuries. But it wasn't really formalized until the early 1900s.
Okay.
And now we have this mathematical equation that describes this relationship.
An equation.
Yeah, it's actually pretty simple. It's S equals C times A to the power of Z.
Okay, so S is the number of species, A is the area C, and Z are constants.
That's it. So as the area of a habitat increases, the number of species you find there also tends to increase.
Okay, but how do we actually use this relationship to understand things like extinction?
Well, it becomes really important when we're talking about habitat loss.
Right, because habitat loss is a major driver of extinction.
Exactly. So let's say you have a big area of grassland,
Okay.
and then someone comes along and converts half of it to farmland.
So the grassland habitat is reduced by 50%.
Yep. And the SAR tells us that over time, that remaining grassland is likely to lose a significant proportion of its original species.
Because it's just not big enough to support the same level of diversity anymore.
Exactly. It's like shrinking the size of biological pie. Eventually, there are fewer slices to go around.
That's a great analogy.
And this brings us to this really influential study that was published in the journal Nature back in 2004.
I think I've heard of that one.
It was led by Chris Thomas and a bunch of other researchers, and it was one of the first studies to really try to quantify the potential impact of climate change on global extinction rates.
Oh, wow.
And they used the SAR, the species area relationship, as a key part of their analysis. Interesting.
So they took projections of future climate change under different scenarios, and then they used the SAR to estimate how much habitat would effectively be lost for different species as their climate niches shifted.
Oh, I see. So they were trying to figure out how much suitable habitat would be left for each species as the climate changed.
Exactly. And then they used that information to estimate the proportion of species that would likely go extinct.
And what were their findings? Well, they actually considered two different scenarios.
Yeah.
One was a no dispersal scenario.
No dispersal, meaning species couldn't move to track suitable climates.
Right, they were stuck in their current ranges.
Okay.
And under that scenario, their projections were pretty dire.
How dire.
Well, depending on the specific climate scenario they looked at, they estimated that anywhere from 22% to 52% of terrestrial plant and animal species could be committed to extinction by 2050.
Whoa, that's a huge range.
It is, and it highlights the uncertainty involved in these kinds of projections.
Oh,
But even the lower end of that range, 22%, that's still a massive loss of biodiversity.
it is.
And then they looked at a more optimistic scenario where species could disperse freely to track suitable climates.
Okay, so that's a more realistic scenario in a way.
It is, but even in that best case scenario, they still projected significant extinctions.
Like how much?
Well, under that universal dispersal scenario, the estimated extinction rates range from 9% to 32%.
Okay, so still a lot lower than the no dispersal scenario, but still a huge loss.
Yeah. And if you average across all their different scenarios, they came up with an estimate of around 24% of species facing extinction by 2050.
That's still a massive number.
It is, and it really shook the scientific community when this study came out.
Yeah, I bet it did.
It was one of the first really comprehensive attempts to quantify the potential scale of this biodiversity crisis.
And it really brought home the urgency of addressing climate change.
Totally. And, there's this quote from Anthony Barnosky, a paleontologist who studies past extinctions, that always stuck with me about this study. He said, "Kill half of what you see."
Wow, that's chilling.
Right. It's a stock way of putting it, but it really captures the potential magnitude of what we're facing.
Yeah, it's not just a few obscure species that are at risk. We're
Yes.
talking about potentially losing a huge chunk of the diversity of life on Earth.
Exactly. And while there's been some debate about the specifics of that 2004 study and the methods they used,
Yeah, I imagine there's always debate in science.
of course.
Yeah.
But the main takeaway is that most subsequent studies have come to similar conclusions.
Meaning we're still looking at a potential extinction rate of around 10% or more.
Yeah, at least. And that's really concerning.
It is.
And, it's important to think about this in the context of Earth's history.
Right. How does this potential extinction event compare to what's happened in the past?
Well, there have been 5 major mass extinction events in Earth's history.
Oh, yeah, the big 5.
Exactly. And those were caused by things like massive volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and other really catastrophic events.
Right.
And those events wiped out huge percentages of